Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, all about conflict avoidance in practice. Today's presentation will be led by ECA's Director of Legal and Business, Rob Driscoll. Rob is joined today by our guests, Martin Burns from RICS and Mohammed Haque of Silver Law LLP. I'll hand over to Rob shortly to properly introduce our panel and kick off today's webinar. But before I do that, I'd just like to remind you that you can use the question mark button on your screen at any time during today's presentation to ask our panel a question about today's discussion. We have some time set aside to address as many of your questions as possible at the end of today's webinar. This webinar will be recorded and the full replay will be available on ECA's YouTube channel. That's at youtube.com/ECA live. Be sure to also check out our other replays from the whole ECA webinar series while you're there, covering other technical and business topics. And with that said, I hope you enjoy today's session, and over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Omar. As Omar introduced, the subject of today is the Conflict Avoidance Pledge and disputes in the pandemic world that we're in right now. In a world where the pandemic hit us, and by and large our contracts weren't ready for it. They didn't have pandemic clauses in them. So where we are now really is we have seen the world around us changed. We're looking at new normals, whatever that means. We're looking at restrictions easing, but we need to figure out how the industry survives and recovers from this episode that we've been through, which just came on the back of Brexit and a number of other issues at the same time. So economically and in terms of the damage it's done to our industry, there are opportunities to come out of it fitter, stronger. And I think this represents one of those opportunities. Omar said I'd give you a bit more introduction, just covering myself. Anybody who's a member of ECA will hopefully know who I am. Director of Legal and Business. By trade, I'm a solicitor. I'm also a CEDA accredited mediator, and I chair the SME Payment Panel Group for the Cabinet Office SME panel, which basically means in public sector procurement terms, we look at how we can improve the payment landscape. But in this context, your two experts for today, which far outshine the likes of me, Mohammed Haque, qualified as a barrister, also acts as an adjudicator, a quantum expert, connected with the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, qualified civil engineer, chartered civil engineer, has dealt with and managed UK and international law firms and claims companies in this context, and is connected with the RICS President's Panel for Adjudicators. And then Martin Burns, who heads up the ADR Research and Development at RICS. Having been with RICS for over 30 years, he's probably seen the inception and the maturity curve of dispute resolution throughout construction. RICS deals with probably over 80, and he may correct me on that, maybe even 90% of adjudication nominations within the construction industry. He's a member of the Pan-Industry Conflict Avoidance Coalition, by trade a barrister, also a member of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, a mediator, and he teaches as well on the Expert Witness Programme and other foundation courses to do with adjudication and conflict management and avoidance. So before we move on, just a chance for my two guests to either correct or add to those introductions. Mohammed, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I mean, very well introduced already, and maybe say things which are more than what I am. But my primary interest remains, as it's always been, conflict resolution. And whether I'm a lawyer acting as a counsel or acting as a neutral, I always try to develop means and methods in which I can minimize the disputes if it's already there, or try so that it doesn't escalate anymore. So that's what's me, a keen advocate of, if possible, avoiding disputes, or if not, then not allowing it to escalate to the point of conflict.
Okay, and Martin, Is there anything you'd like to add to the introduction first?
I thought it was a splendid introduction. Thank you, Rob. Hopefully you'll do more of those for me in the future. Just to clarify what you said, RSS is an adjudicator nominating body. It's around 70 to 80% of all nominations in the sector that we're responsible for. And in fact, I was at RSS when adjudication first came to light and was involved in setting RSS up as an A and B. So I was there right at the very beginning of all of that, and I now feel that I'm pretty much involved at the early stages, if you like, of this whole conflict avoidance movement, which is really starting to gain traction now in the industry.
So moving on, let's introduce what the pledge is. So I'm going to ask Martin to come first and tell us all exactly what a pledge is, because it sounds fairly wide-ranging. And it can sound, pledge, how does that mean anything to us? But we'll go into the roots after we've discussed exactly where it is, what it is, and where it came from. Martin, over to you.
Well, thanks, Rob. I think I'll begin with where it came from. About 5 years ago, I was invited to attend a meeting with senior directors from Transport for London, London Underground, and 4 major project partners who are involved in the refurbishment of the London Underground, including the likes of Taylor Woodrow, Bamnetol, Laing O'Rourke and Costain. And the reason they asked me to go along to that meeting is that TfL and its project partners had decided that they wanted to change the way they manage their relationships and try to avoid the work that they were engaged in from constantly being disrupted by disputes. Now, my understanding of and experience in construction and engineering is that disputes have almost become part of the norm, that people expect disputes to happen. Now, what TfL and the project partners were doing was, in my view, very innovative. They were trying to change their culture, the way they manage their relationships, and introduce a much more cooperative working regime, a shared risk regime, if you like, as well. But they knew that humans being humans, no matter what they did in terms of what they put in their contracts, how willing they were to try and avoid disputes, that there will inevitably be times where there'll be disagreement, where there'll be a difference of opinion on something, and that difference of opinion could turn into a real life dispute. So what they were asking me at the time is if I might be able to help them underpin their collaborative relationship with a resource they could use which would help them to manage any emerging disputes much earlier than adjudication would allow, because of adjudication, the law says that a dispute must have crystallized. Well, they want to be able to deal with it much earlier and much more collaboratively. And we came up with an innovative mechanism which has been baked into contracts on the refurbishment of the London Underground, which we've ultimately called the conflict avoidance process. Though that actually was a bit of a misnomer, because it wasn't about conflict avoidance as such. It was about avoidance of escalation of emerging conflicts. It was about dealing with issues early. TfL baked this into the contract, and it became very worthwhile device. They've been using it for the last 4 or 5 years. Every time they've used it, it has managed to stop disputes in their tracks. Now, following all of that development, we at RSS got a sense that there was an appetite in the construction engineering sector for this kind of approach, for an approach which was much more about trying to avoid and manage conflict better than had previously been the case. And I brought this along to a conference that I was invited to talk to at the Dispute Resolution, Dispute Board Foundation. And people in the audience, there represented organisations like the Institution of Civil Engineers and REBA and the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. And they listened to that. And what came from that, in fact, was a meeting of these organisations. 6 professional organisations, including REBA, RSS, the ICE, and the International Chambers of Commerce, and a couple of others, Transport for London came along to that meeting as well. And we decided that what we would do is form a coalition that would try and promote, and if we can, help the industry to manage disputes and manage conflicts much better than they have previously. And at our first meeting, some bright spark, and I'd like to say it was me, but the fact is it wasn't, but some bright spark said, well, why don't we develop a pledge? And it was explained then that this would be a pledge that organisations and businesses and even individuals could sign up to, which committed them to trying to avoid conflict, putting in place procedures, techniques, contractual clauses as well, that would enable them to manage disputes much earlier than previously been the case, and manage them in a way that looked towards collaborative resolution. We were very lucky because as part of that coalition group that formed, we included, of course, the likes of Transport for London and Network Rail. And they were our audience when we drafted this pledge. And we were thinking, if we got the project directors for both of those companies to sign this pledge, then we knew we had the right wording. And ultimately, we got there, and Transport for London and Network Rail both signed the pledge. And indeed, following that, many of their supply chain also signed up to the pledge. And so the pledge...
Can I take you back over the story slightly and ask a little bit more detail? So roughly which year would it have been when TfL came to you and asked for your help?
That would be around about the end of 2015, early 2016.
Okay.
Somewhere around
so then we have a framework style client, a client with a lot of repeat pipeline work in the offing, that I'm deliberately being provocative, because what I want our members to come out of this presentation and to get from you and Mohammed is how this translates into their daily life and contracts. They might either be working for some of these bodies already, but if we go back to the pledge, I've just put the slide on to the brands you said that were primarily responsible for the pledge in the first place, but I'll take it back a step to the pledge itself. The concept of the pledge, I can see, that's a standard. It's a bit like the prompt payment code. People say, what's that? How does it touch me? If I could describe it as a standard, it doesn't really matter whether we call it a pledge or a code or whatever. It's a line in the sand that industry collectively draws, saying this is the benchmark for whatever that thing is. So presumably on this one, this is the benchmark for disputes, conflict management and resolution. Would that be fair?
I think that's fair. I think our mindset at first was pretty aspirational, that what we were asking people to is to aspire to the principle set out in the pledge, without any process in place that would actually monitor that. But the idea was to start the ball rolling with this concept of organisations thinking about how to deal with conflict much better and much earlier than they had previously.
Okay. So in terms of the promises that people make within the pledge, is it fair to say that they're fairly generic, so it leaves the door open for each set of clients or supply chain members to decide how best that works within the context of their bilateral contracts?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And indeed, when we've seen people now who are, if you like, living the pledge, they're doing it in different ways.
Okay.
And that, I think, is encouraging. And there was a deliberate attempt by us, I think, to make sure that the pledge itself didn't tie people to specific actions, because if we did that, we could prevent some organisations, I think, from actually signing up to the pledge.
So I'm just going to take the slides forward slightly and show everybody, because I think this is a really good time to say, look, there are 250 signatories to this Conflict Avoidance Pledge. It's been endorsed by the CITV Forum in Scotland. the Construction Leadership Council across the UK. This is just an alphabetical list, but it really does take everybody through just how far people have got with this. But I guess questions that come up in my mind, and I'll move on and ask Mohammed for his view in a second from maybe a technical or practical adjudication perspective. Thoughts that crop up in my mind from a cynical coalface perspective, so you'll forgive me for that. Leaving the door open to make it contextual in the context of each bilateral relationship, depending on the tier you're at, makes absolute common sense. But the flip side to that is inconsistency. How do we deal with that? Because you mentioned it was conceived in 2015. We're in 2021, post-pandemic. We've got critical mass of 250 signatories. How do we know it's working?
That is a very good question, Rob, and I think there's a number of answers to that. I think, first of all, when the pledge was launched, and the pledge was launched, I think, in 2017, 2018, I forget. Sorry, forgive me, I forget precisely when. There was an immediate rush of organisations to sign up to it. And we, as part of this coalition, thought, well, how are we going to help those organisations give effect to that commitment? You know, that we felt responsible for, since we developed the pledge, to help those organisations find a way to make it happen if they're signing up to the pledge. When we got to lockdown in March 2020, there were 120 signatories to the pledge. By the end of August, I think that got close to 180. It's suddenly jumped. And that 250 mark has been reached. If you like, the numbers have doubled during the COVID pandemic. And I think part of that has been because of a number of tactics, a number of strategies that were applied. One is to get the government to encourage organisations to sign up to the pledge. And the other is we're now developing a system whereby people who sign up to the organisations that sign up to the pledge are effectively tiered as bronze, silver, gold. And the bronze is they've signed the pledge, which effectively is just saying that we agree with this, we agree with the pledge, we will agree to do this. But there's nothing there that demonstrates that they have indeed done it. Now we're inviting.
ECA would sit in that category as a flag bearer that supports the pledge.
Exactly, I like that word, flag bearer, as a flag bearer that supports the pledge. But what we're trying to do now is to encourage organisations to actually adopt some of the principles set out in the pledge and the techniques that we can have, as various organisations can help them with. And so there's a silver and gold level, and the silver level is effectively that perhaps adapted their contracts to include mechanisms such as early neutral evaluation or CAP, the conflict avoidance process, or a mediative process that comes in before escalation to adjudication, but certainly has taken steps to try and prevent disputes, or at least nip them in the bud as early as possible. And then there's a gold standard, and the gold standard is very much around they're actually living the pledge. And if I could, a really good example is the first organisation that achieved gold standard was Network Rail. And Network Rail has done an enormous amount of work in terms of developing dispute avoidance panels, but also really working closely with its supply chain to make sure that the supply chain is engaged with them right across the board, and that disputes, as they start to emerge, are dealt with on a much more sort of relaxed basis. Network Rail have also adopted, in some cases, and utilised the CAP process, which was the same process we developed for Transport for London. This is part of.
If I can bring Mohammed in at this point, I think it's worth taking it a step further, because I think this is a really good conversation. I'm showing people the kind of last slide before the question one. And that's because I wanted to give people an idea that in theory, if you're a conflict theorist in construction terms, you have the hardened, lengthy and costly process right down to the very soft in conflict avoidance. If I could turn this diagram vertically, it would probably make more sense. But you, in one sense, you start at the very the one end of the spectrum of litigation court processes, which is what everybody tends to traditionally think of conflict resulting in. I'm going to see you in court. To give people at home an idea of that, there have been several attempts over the years to declutter the courts from traffic. The wharf reforms were a major step forward in that sense of trying to steer people towards mediation, etc. We had an Arbitration Act in '96. I may be wrong on that, actually. We had an Arbitration Act formalising on a statutory footing the process of arbitration, which was a technical expert confidentially making a decision over the dispute. And then we decided to introduce statutory adjudication in '98, following the 1996 Act, following the Latham report in the early '90s, which basically reinvented, in my mind, a mini fast arbitration service, but renamed adjudication, where again you could have a technical expert, this time to a 28-day fixed period, which could be extended by 14 days with agreement of both parties. Below that, you start to lose the idea of getting a decision where somebody's right and somebody's wrong, but you broker a deal. So when you step into mediation, some of us around this table as mediators, the most effective mediation doesn't give a judgment on an outcome. It simply finds a spot where both parties have managed to move to what could best be described as a palatable outcome, i.e. a settlement. And conciliation might be a version where it's less structured than mediation, and then you've got the parties just coming together and negotiating it, hammering it out themselves in some kind of agreement. So for both of you, unless you disagree with that, or you might add in things like early neutral evaluation or expert determination from judges or other experts, or even dispute avoidance boards on large projects, into that spectrum, that rainbow of conflict resolution. My question, and I'm going to go for Mohammed first, is Martin's really eloquently described the conceptual background, what the pledge is as a concept, but it's left to the parties, the 250 signatories, which really we're concentrating on the gold and the silvers here, to see how they put it into practice. I know from previous experience that London Underground TfL tend to like an NEC, and we'll tend to add some 21 pages of amendments in there. It's been a while since I've touched one, but that was certainly my last experience of them. How do we make sure this works for all parties and consistently across the system?
Well, I mean, I would start by adding actually one other thing into the whole bag that's not been discussed by you. That's management level resolution attempts, because all that the examples we have seen presupposes that a dispute has reached a point where the parties and the immediate parties cannot find a solution between them. That's common in all the names you have given there on your chart. And whether we call it litigation, arbitration, adjudication, mediation, conciliation, and as I just said while concluding, that hammering a negotiation, one thing is there, though a different degree. That's an attitude of winning a dispute. And despite each one of these legs or streams are very good, the ownership of the dispute is totally lost once it gets into that process. the representatives become the owners, and then the neutrals become the owners of the dispute. And unless there is an early intervention where in presence of a facilitator, I would say, the parties reevaluate in their own way that what the dispute actually is, and is there anything they can do to find out a solution within the, of course, the contractual framework they have signed up to it, including, as I frequently say, that understanding the contract, and what different thoughts were there into the minds of the parties when they were signing up to it, and was it really realistic to achieve? Now, these are things, when it comes from an expert in the industry and who's neutral as well, and not trying to impose a decision or a process, because as soon as a procedure is laid down, the hands of the facilitator becomes tied, and also the parties, they try to, through their representatives, try to feed in a set kind of rule of legal dispute, factual dispute, evidence, blah blah, and then it tends to go to winning or losing of points. But the beauty of this, I was more or less, as Martin said, I was involved right from the beginning, because I've come across the idea whilst I think Chris Myers came to our branch CIR to give a talk on for something else, and it just came out that he's also working on that. And then I've come to know from him that John Fletcher is the guy. So I've invited him to give a talk. And one thing I remember from that initial talk back in 2016 or early 2017, that there are two things that has never been addressed. One is a post-dispute relationship, and which is very vital, at least in construction, because you do not want to lose your supply chain as an employer. Neither do the contractors and subcontractors want to go away every now and again to new employers. It's beneficial for all of them, keeping aside the cost issue of litigation, arbitration, adjudication. And the other thing is, the freedom to be absolutely feeling free to discuss it. And if we limit it like a process, and you have to go by these are the rules, rather than a kind of a strategic direction as a pledge can give you, that these are the ground rules you have to keep in your mind when you are progressing through, and we're not going to limit it. I think these are the two things are the hallmarks of this. And if we want to be successful, we've got to accept the fact that end of the day, any dispute or conflict is by and of the parties, not by anyone else. And unless they decide and choose to come to a solution, no one can help. But only when we can try to help develop that choice, and more parties choose it, it becomes successful.
So a question for both of you, but I'll start by asking Martin. Is Martin, you said project directors signed up to the pledge, but presumably it depends on what organisation you're with, whether it's project director or CEO. But you want the main person who leads the organisation, as I said, with us it would be flag bearers, bronze, to be able to commit the organisation to it. Do we? Well, my question for Martin would be, how do we then know that organisation is doing it? And my question for Mohammed will be, if I commit to it as an organisation, and I've got the question, well, right, now tell me what I need to do. Put my JCT on my NEC or whichever other form I go with, in order to follow the philosophy that Mohammed's just outlined. So Martin first.
I mentioned a moment or two ago that we're kind of creating this hierarchy of bronze, silver and gold. And RSS has taken on the burden on behalf of the coalition to manage that process and manage that strategy. So what we're doing is, first of all, we're inviting signatories to the pledge to apply to be silver or gold members, and there's a criteria and everything else that goes with that, which we will monitor and we will check. And of course, part of that is to ensure that whoever's signing off on it is the decision maker within that organization. We'll also then put in process an auditing mechanism. And that auditing mechanism will be either on an annual or maybe 2 or 3 year basis. But it means going back to those businesses in order to make sure that what they're signed up to and where they've achieved either silver or gold, that they're actually doing it. And we want evidence to demonstrate that. So we'll be putting that in place as we're going forward over the next 12, maybe 18 months. So that's part of that. I think also there is moves afoot and discussions certainly going on with some of the larger signatories, that they're looking at maybe rating their suppliers, in the sense that suppliers who are tendering for works are tendering sometime on a points-based system, and that points will be given for different aspects of the tender. And part of it will be that if they're not a signatory to the pledge, that they will be rated as 0 on that point. If they're a signatory to the pledge, they will be rated with 1 point. If they have achieved silver, and they will be achieve 3 points, and you get 5 points for being gold. Now that kind of is an incentivization, if you like, to be involved in the pledge, but also to be doing what is necessary. So there are a number of plans afoot that are moving forward quite rapidly now in order to try and make sure that organisations that sign the pledge are doing what they say they're doing when they achieve either the bronze, silver and gold.
So that's really encouraging. There's follow through there, and there is commitment and follow up, I guess, to make sure it's not just an empty promise, that a political PR stunt. So if we go there, then, and I turn to Mohammed, and I'm a new organisation, I'm really keen on this. I can see the transformational agenda behind the philosophy. What do I need to do to my JCTs or my bespoke? I mean, invariably in my old life in private practice as a solicitor, we were hired to, let's say, create a bulletproof vest of terms and conditions that we would hang over the client or tier one or whichever one we represented at the time to de-risk the business. Is there something I need to change in there? Something we need to add?
Well, I mean, let's start from NEC, because NEC has a section and a clause which expressly talks about collaborative approach and all these. And obviously JCT has it, but you have to tick the box in whether that applies or not. So, and I'm glad that you brought it in. And sometimes I felt that there is almost like a conflict to advise a client to open or expose its position to a risk that it will not achieve everything it wants, the way it sees the best value under the contract. So when it comes to a lawyer, it's given a thought that, look, I don't care if the project succeeds or not. I have a client in hand, and I got to work for the best interest of that client. In that process, we have created battles and wars, and then even people get insolvent and just lost. And of course, bigger players do not. It doesn't happen on a daily basis, but smaller players, it happens on a regular basis. So the fundamental thing, I would say, and that's where I always advocate, that's the success of this lies in building awareness among the representatives and especially lawyers, or quantity surveyors advising, giving their clients contract advice, that there is a better approach, which is collaborative, and we should all agree to that. Now, that's something, as you just said, it's something that I can't enforce on anybody. I can tell my client that, look, you should try this, but if they don't agree, then my choices are limited. But the other thing I will point out, that Network Rail, which reached the gold standard, they have developed, and primarily I think that's where we should be. They have developed a procedure called DAP, okay, and that's added to their contracts. And and when you automatically have a clause, and they act like in anticipation of disputes with the board. Now, because you're an association, you can kind of start a scheme like that in association with RICS and cause your members to sign up to it and have clauses which facilitates in each of their contracts that they will have, that they would opt for this conflict avoidance. And just as Rail did, and soon you'll find that the benefit of it.
So I guess you're quite right to lay the challenge back at us, ECA and our members. We have 2,700 members that exist at tiers 1, 2, 3, 4 in both the consumer and mostly the commercial and FM space. They will look at this webinar, hopefully, and see the right philosophy, but wonder if this chart that I'm showing isn't just an excuse to go through costly formal or informal means of dispute resolution whilst they're waiting to get paid. They're often on the receiving end of money, not the paying party, and therefore the problem with some of this is it can be open to abuse. I'm well aware of that, and I'm sure you guys are as mediators, that some people can use it as a fishing exercise just to test the other party and wind them up. And I'm being deliberately cynical here, by the way. I'm not specifically trying to undermine what's being achieved. I think it's absolutely spot on in that sense. But I think we've just got to be realistic. So we are emphatic fans of the Network Rail system because with their framework approach and their specific supply chain requirements, they've managed to walk away from cash retentions, for example. Just abolish them and don't use them at all. And I can actually see how this would work in the context of an NEC contract. You've got a risk register, an early warning system. You've got conflict being seen or spotted by the project team, and the ability to, under target cost provisions, share the pain or the gain. What about a JCT, where it's a bit more black and white, his fault, her fault? Does it still work in that kind of one-off relationship?
If you ask me, no, because as I said, there is a process which allows parties to adopt to it if they tick the box of the contract particulars at the time of entering into the contract. But there isn't any mandatory clause which actually helps or causes the party to take this route at all. Whereas, as you all know, NEC is different.
Okay. And Martin,
sorry, I was just to say I was trying to agree with Mo on that, but just to add that in order to use most of these processes that you have here, including DAP and CAP, you don't necessarily need to have them embedded within the contract, or you can add them to the contract as you see. And indeed, the CAP process itself was an amended form of the NEC, so there was a clause that TfL agreed with its project partners to incorporate into the NEC form, which was unique to those contracts.
But it's an interesting point, and you both I think know that from my history, my personal career history, I used to work with the law firm that invented PPC 2000, which notably would have claimed at the time to taken the best of JCT and NEC and blended it into what became PPC 2000, often enclosed a dispute resolution hierarchy or escalation procedure. And for those kind of watching this back, fancy names for this kind of ladder that you go through on the screen of dispute resolution systems. But the propensity was that the client would roll this down within the context of the project. The supply chain would kind of nod and say, okay, but be as slightly cynical as I described before, that these were simply extra hoops to jump through before we could resolve disputes. And the philosophical conflict here was, if you've got to embed the conflict resolution system in the contract to force people to use it, you've already gone wrong, because they should be using it voluntarily. The other one I wanted to ask you about, maybe this is better answered by Mohammed, because I do have a question for you in a second, Martin, is you said it could be a neutral third party who would act as the kind of dispute resolution advisor, or whatever label we want to give it. Again, in my previous experience, the partnering advisor in the context of those projects was often claimed to be neutral. All the bills for the partnering advisor were paid for by the client. So the paymaster generally, whoever that is, tends to sway their mind. I mean, we know that certain professionals within the construction industry, architects, etc., have a notional legal duty to act within their PI insurance professionally and independently. But inevitably, you still favour your paymaster. What would you say to that?
I mean, it's a very vital point, I would say, and I actually raised this in yesterday's discussion as well. That not only it is the way you have put forward, it's something like natural justice, that it's not only should be done, it's seen to have been done neutrally, and rightly or wrongly, the parties, even if the neutral is a true neutral, when the payments are coming from one source, it's been thought by the others that it's just a way out to take out our bargaining power, you know, and there, first of all, the duty comes to the suppliers of the experts, you know, be it our ICS or anyone else. Similarly, the ones who are representing them, how are we going to train them? How are we going to go to the industry to establish an image that these people are truly neutral? Secondly, as you have mentioned, that if we are going to, let's say, cap, and fortunately it's an NEC, and we have on an ad hoc basis, we didn't say anything about cap, but after signing the contract, one of the parties said, okay, we'll go to cap now, to our ICS, to send someone to look at it. It has to be quite an early stage, because otherwise, if the dispute reaches the point where people think that no, it's no more, it cannot be resolved anymore, it has to go to somebody who's completely different from us, and we'll have a look at it. Then you lose the efficiency or the result you are trying to achieve here, because my understanding is the beauty of this process is you are facilitating a process through which the parties who are immediately connected to it, the dispute, and around the time when they start disputing, they get a chance to re-evaluate themselves in front of a neutral. And if, like DAP does, I've just come to know yesterday that they run a panel. Just you can do that, the association, and you run the panel, and the individuals are not at all connected. So people who are your members, they can feel confident that, all right, we are a member to the association. The association has taken the burden to run a panel. So we can call the association to nominate someone to us. We agree, and then we discuss. And the beauty of DAP is it's just taking a step ahead. That if you are a member, you can sign up to it, and to the project, people might go. But the challenge is, would the employer, the paying party, agree to that? Because if your member is a contractor, I still don't know how he can cause the other side to agree. Right at the beginning.
It becomes, I guess, a bit like mediation. For it to work, you need both parties to voluntarily participate in an industry which is predominantly filled with fairly aggressive males. We don't like backing down. We tend to say, well, as you described earlier, somebody wants to win a fight. I'm well aware of that. Martin, for you, I'm interested in this theory of we standardize the behavior and we have a rating system that you described, because that's very much the philosophy we've pursued within Cabinet Office and government on payment. So we've used prompt payment code and we've used the PPN to standardize what the expectations around payment behavior look like. And then we've pulled by saying you can't win any future work unless you meet those standards or better. So it's what they call the theory of nudge behavior through pulling, because adding more deterrence, pushing doesn't seem to work. To create that feedback loop, we called it the eBay feedback loop, but there are multiple analogies you could use. Is there some way we can kind of cross-match these initiatives in the industry? We've got CAP, sounds wonderful, the philosophy behind it. We have Build UK and the industry pre-qualification system, CAS. Is there a way that this doesn't have to stand independently and we can build it into other systems of monitoring behaviour?
I think the answer to that must be yes, because I love the idea of not just creating boxes and putting things into a box or a single process and that's that. I like the idea of being able to adapt and to innovate and to draw on the best practice here and best practice there and make something else that is even better and do it that way. What we've seen, in fact, as well, is that different organisations, for example, that have utilised CAP have done it in slightly different ways, and they've drawn on what works for them particularly. The Urban Growth Company, which I mentioned earlier in this discussion, who are engaged in the redevelopment of Birmingham International Railway Station, for example, have taken the CAP process but utilised it in a different way. One of the things they've done, incidentally, is they've said that organisations tendering for work on that project need to be signatories to the pledge. But they also say that we want to incorporate within your contracts the CAP process. And that CAP process has been adapted in a way that's slightly different from how it works for TfL. What's been immensely encouraging is we've seen, some key organisations, which I don't think I can identify here and now, who have signed up to this process because it's been adapted in a way that works for them. But those organisations you wouldn't have thought would be have the mindset to do it, to actually use something as innovative and as is more about conflict avoidance than dispute resolution.
Okay. Omar, we're running towards the last 10 minutes of our webinar today. Did we had any questions in the chat thread at all?
Thanks, Rob. Yes, we've got time for a couple of questions from the audience. First one is there any free advice or top tips that you could give to help avoid contractual conflict from the outset?
Can I?
Yep.
Yes.
The work of the Conflict Coalition that I mentioned throughout this webinar hasn't just been restricted to developing the pledge and developing a strategy to get organisations to sign up to it and to live that. Another one of the things that the coalition has developed is what we call a conflict avoidance toolkit. And it's a top-level information piece which answers this question. It gives individuals and people, organisations, information about what they can actually actively do in order to avoid, manage and resolve disputes quickly and cost effectively. And it starts right at the beginning when you're forming the contract, get the contract right, and what you need to be looking at, right through to, well, everything else hasn't happened and you've ended up in a dispute. What's the best way to get it resolved? That means I don't end up spending six-figure or even more in a court of law. And that toolkit is, it's very simple to obtain. You can get it from the RSS website, and it has that top-level information. But what it also does is it finger posts you to where you can get further information, either through RSCS or the ICE or REBA or other organisations that have that specific information.
I think I'd give an answer to this one as well, Omar, which is something Mohammed picked up on earlier, which is the role of lawyers and advisors. So traditionally, a lawyer is hired to fight one side of a fight, but it is the tool to which the company who engages the lawyer uses to achieve what it wants to achieve. So the lawyer can be quite conservative and hide behind its own PI insurance and say, right, I need to do everything in my power to protect my clients. That is the conservative position. Ultimately, the lawyer does what they're instructed to do. They can't do anything else. They're not allowed to. So it's down to the person holding the gun as to whether they pull the trigger or not. So i.e. the client instructs the lawyer, not the other way round. And therefore, I would encourage all clients to, if you want a fair and reasonable lawyer, tell your lawyer to behave fairly and reasonably. We can do it if we're pushed to. Mohammed, do you have an answer to this one?
Yeah, I mean, see, the first thing I always say that end of the day, whether you want a determination or a win or a resolution or a solution or avoidance is end of the day your baby, meaning the baby of the parties to the contract. Now, until and unless they decide that they want something where they will have a less and less winning, let's say that way, because the very phrase of protecting the interest of the client the best way is, to me, doesn't explain anything unless we know what is the interest we are talking about. Now, if someone can see the bigger picture, someone mean the client, that, well, I want to build a good relationship with an employer or a contractor in the long run, so that I am quite sure that if we survive, we will survive jointly and together and in a collaborative manner. Only then they will ask the lawyer right from the day one that can you suggest me what I can do about it. Otherwise, the lawyer's hands are tied as well, because they generally come to us with the attitude that kill them all and come back alone. Why have I come to you? Unless you know how to beat them. So that's something should start quite early, and even at the point of procurement, or before procurement, that is there any way I can find out and built into my contract, which will result into this kind of collaborative arrangement.
And I think that's a philosophy that should cross right down to your house extension or loft conversion. To be quite honest, whether advising the homeowner or the builder, I would turn around and say, look, rather pay another 500 quid to get the job done properly than go another 2 months, 3 months, whatever it takes, and argue over 5 grand. Wouldn't you just cut your losses? Whether you think the morals cost money and principles do. But Omar, do you have any other questions?
Martin, you mentioned some more information about the pledge on the internet. So can you remind us what the where the best place is to find more information about the Conflict Avoidance Pledge, maybe a list of the signatories as well.
Yeah, can I give you a web address now that people can maybe write down?
Please do, and
Yes.
I'll include that in the underneath the video replay of the session as well.
Okay, this will give you access to the pledge. It'll give you access to who signed it, who was behind it, the organisations behind it, but also gives access to the information I mentioned, the toolkit information about different things that people can do to help them avoid and manage disputes. And the website is rcs.org/CAPLEDGE, CAPLEDGE.
Thank you. Thanks, Martin. And that information, if you're watching the replay right now, will be in the description for this video. Final question before we wrap up for the evening. How are the signatories of the pledge monitored?
We touched on that, I think, a couple of times in the discussion here, that we're putting together a process now which will invite all pledge signatories to either apply for silver or gold. If they've applied bronze, silver or gold, the bronze is simply that they have signed the pledge. So there's not a great deal of monitoring we need to do with them, because as Rob described, they're effectively standard bearers. They're saying, yes, this is something that we think is the right thing to do. In terms of the other signatories that are applying for silver and gold, there'll be an application process that they would need to go through. It doesn't cost them anything, by the way. That application process means they have to demonstrate that they've achieved the criteria for silver and gold. That also is on that website I mentioned a moment or two ago, what that criteria is. And that we're putting in place as we're going forward in order to that on a regular basis. We will be seeking out those who've signed up to the pledge at silver and gold to ensure that they are consistently achieving the standards that make them silver and gold members.
Okay, thank you, Martin.
Thanks.
We're just coming up to the hour, so we will wrap up there for the evening. If you are currently watching this as a replay on YouTube or catching us on social media, and do you have any questions that come to mind while you're watching this, please email them to publicaffairs@eca.co.uk, and we'll do our very best to get those answered for you.
Can I just add, Omar, that you will also find on the RICS website details of the low-value adjudication service, which would fit within the context of conflict resolution for anybody who had questions over that, trying to make conflict resolution slightly cheaper and more efficient. And to just give you one closing statement, one of the headline features of one of the oldest books in the world, The Art of War, is to not have conflict and avoid it where possible. Nobody wins through out and out black and white fights. The best solution is to avoid it entirely. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Mo. Thank you, everybody. Bye, Mo.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.